Hello, welcome. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, keeper of the Imperial Space Hopper, owner of the last indentured serfs in England, and periodic publisher on this platform of history videos. And you, dear viewer, are here, hopefully, because you want to know more about the Dams Raid and everything thereafter. For those of you who may not have been here before, fear thee not, whilst this is part 3 of my video on the subject. Today, we are focusing primarily on the raid itself, and even those of you that require removal of your shoes and socks to count past 10 should be able to keep up. Those of you, of course, from the Forest of Dean are already somewhat ahead of the rest of us, as you can routinely count to 12 on your fingers. We shall, in the interests of time and decency, dispense with the rank commercialism and get, as they say, to the fricking point. When we last left our protagonists, things were not going at all well. Having taken off from Scampton in 2 waves, those taking the northerly route had been killed or forced back, leaving just 1 aircraft piloted by American Joe McCarthy to go and attack the Sorpe Dam. 21 men were dead, and as yet nary a dam had been upkeeped. Just after midnight on the 17th of May, Gibson, Hopgood and Martin made it to the Möhne Dam. Aerial recon of the dam had done what aerial recon often does and not quite got the whole picture. They expected 3 flak guns, but there were actually 6, but as they exploded into life from all sides, it felt like a hell of a lot more. For their sakes, it was as well there were no searchlights on the dam itself, or the attacks would have been impossible. And into this maelstrom of fire in the half-dark over water, Guy Gibson prepared to drop his 30-ton aircraft, now with a spinning ball of death, to a height of 60 feet to run into the target, ideally without dying before he'd let the weapon go exactly 450 yards before the dam wall. Having circled round to check the line of his approach, Gibson called over the radio, "Hello, cooler aircraft. I'm going to make an attack. Stand by to come in the order I tell you." And then a moment later, "Hello, Mother. Stand by to take over if anything happens to me." Due to the administrative pressure on Gibson, he'd done fewer practice flights than anyone else in the squadron. It might have been expected that he would stand back and let somebody else go first, but it was typical Gibson that it didn't occur to him that this was an approach he should take. Instead, he led from the front. As soon as the eldest lamps on the belly of G. George went on, every gun in the area knew precisely where to aim. It's sometimes easy to forget that on these aircraft, in fact, the entire crew was talking all at once. This was a symphony of effort from everybody on board, acting as a team. Gibson flew the aircraft, but he was responding to height instructions from Terry Taham, his nav, who's checking the eldest lamps, his bomb aimer, Spam Spafford, who was checking for the line, his flight engineer, John Polford, had the throttles controlling the speed, and each of them was singing out a running commentary in his allotted task. And the flak all the time came whipping past the aircraft as the nose gunner let rip at the defenders. It's impossible to imagine just how loud, how stressful, how fucking scary this whole thing must have been for both attackers and defenders alike. As I hurtled toward the dam, Gibson said in a quiet voice to Pulford, "Leave the throttles, John, and stand by to pull me out of the seat if I'm hit." Quite what good that might have done at this point is anyone's guess, but the brain does funny things in moments of extreme fear and stress. "Mine gone," shouted Spam Spafford from the nose, and immediately Gibson hauled the Lancaster upwards, the tail gunner pouring fire into the flak positions. And seconds later, the upkeep exploded almost dead centre against the wall of the dam, throwing a jet of water 1,000 feet into the air. For a moment, everybody thought that they'd done it, but as the water calmed, the dam still stood. And here we enter into one of the legends of the attack, John Hopgood and M. Mother's attack on the Möhne Dam. According to rear gunner Jack Boucher, M. Mother had, in fact, been hit by flak somewhere on the flight across Denmark and Germany. Hopgood had been hit in the face, and the front gunner was either killed or just rendered unconscious, but either way, was not responding to the intercom. As Boucher was at the back, the intercom was the only way he could tell how bad it was, and he could hear the efforts of the flight engineer to clear the blood off Hopgood's face. Hopgood told the crew that he was going to continue on to the Möhne. Now over the reservoir, Hopgood had to wait a good 4 minutes for the water to calm down enough for him to be able to make his run, and just as he turned in, Maudsley and Knight appeared on the scene, and they could see Tracer streaming out in the dark from one of the towers to hit the port wing of M. Mother, just as John Fraser was about to release the bomb. The upkeep skipped clean over the dam wall, plummeting downwards and exploding in a blinding flash, spraying the wall and M. Mother with shrapnel. With flames coming from the engines on the wings, Hopgood screamed over the intercom, "For Christ's sake, get out!" as he frantically fought for height to allow the crew to use their parachutes. Fraser ripped open his escape hatch, pulled the ripcord on his chute, stuffed the material out of the hatch and was dragged clear. In the tail, Jack Boucher had time to try and grab the heavily wounded navigator, pull his chute and push him out of the door before he too jumped clear as M. Mother finally gave up the fight and plummeted into the ground. Somehow both Fraser and Boucher survived, but none of the rest of the crew did. And so it was that Guy Gibson watched in real time as his best friend died. But the mission had to go on. Somehow he brought himself to call calmly and levelly over the VHF to Aussie Harold, Mickey, Martin and P. Popsy to turn in and make their attack. To increase their chances, Gibson turned his aircraft to fly next to P. Popsy and ordered his gunners to shoot their 100% tracer at the flak positions wherever possible in order to draw the fire. Quite what the bloody hell his crew must have thought when he did this, they didn't say then, nor indeed afterwards, but if it had been me, I would have been quietly wishing him a swift death when I wasn't around. Martin's aircraft too was hit at the critical moment, but not badly enough to bring it down. Instead, their bomb skipped to the left, missed the dam entirely and exploded against the banks. Back at 5 Group HQ, the code word Goner had now been received 3 times, meaning that there had been 3 attacks, 2 of which were close, but as yet there was no breach. Wallace's mood in 5 Group control was increasingly black as he began to wonder if all of this had been a colossal waste of effort, resources, and now young men's lives. For the first time in the whole process, Wallace appears to have realised only then that he was asking young men to die in order to deliver this weapon, and he appeared to be overwhelmed by grief. Next into the attack was Melvin Dingy Young in A. Apple, a man who'd been twice fished out of the North Sea back in 1940, hence the name, and he came in with Martin on his wing, firing furiously to cover him, and Gibson flying in parallel as close as he could to the dam, flicking his navigation lights on and off to confuse the defenders. The idea of putting your sodding lights on over an enemy flak position deliberately, having just watched your best mate get shot down, makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever you think of Gibson, this was an enormously brave act. Young's bomb hit the wall plumb centre and 6,600 pounds of Torpex exploded at a depth of precisely 30 feet right up against the wall as per spec. And nothing. There was, by now, a sense of desperation, both in the aircraft circling the dam and back in 5 Group HQ. Perhaps this weapon didn't work. Next up was 23-year-old David Maudsley in J. Johnny. The flak towers on the dam itself had now both jammed, making his task considerably easier, and he too managed a perfect release. But as he did so, somebody said that they saw a crack in the dam wall. His upkeep struck that wall, spun down below the surface, and exploded once more, this time throwing up not just water but brick and mud too, and as the gout crashed back down again, it revealed a massive gap in the damned wall. "It's gone! It's gone!" someone shouted over the intercom. Back in 5 Group HQ, confirmation of the breach came through at 0056, and there was jubilation in the control room. Harris was supposed to have turned to Wallace and said, "I didn't believe a word that you said when you came to see me. Now you could sell me a pink elephant." He was tactful enough not to mention that he'd once suggested that Wallace have his balls cut off in an official communication. In the air, Martin and Maltby turned for home, whilst Gibson, Young, Knight, Maudsley and Shannon turned to try and find the Eder Dam in the rising mists and folds of the Valley of the Tsar. On the ground, the floodwaters began to pour out. As Gibson was lining up his run on the Möhne, Joe McCarthy was bringing his aircraft, T. Tommy, on its first run against the Sorpe. There was no flak here, no spinning bomb, and no downside in favour of a parallel attack run. And somewhat to the crew's surprise, there were no other aircraft either. Originally, Joe and his crew were supposed to be flying their own Type 464 Q Queenie, the plane that they practiced and got used to, but at the last minute, mechanical defects had meant switching to T. Tommy, a plane that had been used for all manner of testing at Boscombe Down. It was in rough shape, and it was missing various bits of kit, not least a working VHF radio and the Aldous lamps that everybody else had for working out their height. This was deeply unhelpful, and they had no idea where everybody else who was supposed to be helping on the attack was. In fact, in reality, those men were either dead or already back at base by this point. The Sorpe was 700 metres long, at the end of which was a bloody great big hill and the wonderfully named village of Langscheid, which included, amongst other things, a dirty great big church steeple. At 180 miles an hour, McCarthy's bomb aimer Johnny Johnson had just seconds from the start of the run to drop the weapon, and Joe had mere moments more to try and then haul 30 tons of aeroplane away from a date with the scenery. For the next 30 minutes, T. Tommy made pass after pass after pass in an attempt to get drop right, but each time Johnson in the nose or McCarthy himself would call dummy run and pull the plane out of the attack. Eventually a voice over the intercom said, "Won't someone get that fucking bomb out of here?" Finally, on their 10th run, T. Tommy dropped its ordnance just fractionally beyond the halfway point. It sank and exploded, sending another great surge of water into the air, but to no effect. The Sorpe remained, apparently, undamaged as T. Tommy flew home. It's worth asking at this point, given that Joe McCarthy had just spent 30 minutes floating around above a dam, German air defence, you okay, hun? Because, my God, if you were looking at the perfect chance to annihilate an RAF raid, this was it. The night was crystal clear, under a full moon with no distractions. These 30-ton bombers were just lazily circling around a handful of obvious targets. Surely you could go and find them and shoot them down. Even without radar working, ground observers, of which there were hundreds, had phoned in reports along the plane's flight path all the way since they crossed the coast at Denmark. So where the hell were the fighters? And it's a question that's difficult to answer, although various crew did report seeing them high in the sky above them. No attacks occurred. The German night fighting system we talked a little bit about last time, but it had been developed by a guy called Joseph Kamhuber, and it was a very Nazi system in that it relied on ground controllers talking fighters onto an intercept, using Würzburg radar systems to call those fighters onto a particular track in a particular box against a particular target. The fighter was required to follow the controller's instructions precisely and not deviate from the height, heading or course being called to them until their onboard Liechtenstein radars acquired the bomber. And this did not chime very well with the Luftwaffe's Knights of the Air mentality, which really wanted somehow to allow natural fighter pilot instincts to operate, even if it was in the dark when they couldn't see. But, it's the Luftwaffe. A huge bun fight was actually building up in the background between the night fighter pilots and Göring on one hand and Kamhuber on the other. On the night of the 16th, 17th of May, everything that could go wrong did go wrong for the Nachtjager. The radars couldn't lock onto the low-flying aircraft, the night fighters weren't allowed operational flexibility to go hunting, the targets weren't in the usual areas that they normally went to because they weren't going to the big cities. Effectively, the entire system just blue-screened. The decision by Gibson to fly low was certainly dangerous, and some crew had died as a result, but it almost certainly saved the raid from total annihilation. By 0130, the first wave of aircraft that remained, thanks to some really superb navigation, had managed to find the Eder Dam. Just to be sure, Gibson fired a red flare, at which point Dave Shannon admitted later that he and his crew realised they'd been making ready to bomb the wrong end of the reservoir. Nonetheless, they managed to form up quickly enough. At the Möhne, the challenge had been flak, but here it was terrain. The run into the Eder was ridiculously short, ending in a bloody great mountain, the Misselkopf, which meant that the moment that the bomb was released, the massive bomber had to be flung about the sky like a fighter to avoid an unexpected merge with exciting topography. There were no guns here because the Luftwaffe had taken one look at it and considered that any bombing approach would be impossible. In all, the pilots and crews had less than 45 seconds from the moment that they dropped down to the water to the moment that they needed to reverse corkscrew out at the other end. And in that time, they had to settle the aircraft level, hit the right speed, get the altitude right, line up on the towers with the whole crew babbling away at their different measures, and some poor sod in the front trying to line up his lollipop sticks on a pair of tiny little towers. Little wonder, then, that when Shannon in L Leather gave it the first go, he needed a new set of trousers when he called dummy run, and he made to try and haul the Lancaster out of the way of the mountain with 9,250 pounds of upkeep, merrily revolving away like a spinning top on his belly and trying to drag his aircraft all over the sky. In fact, Shannon tried 4 times to get down into the slot in the time to make an accurate drop, but each time he had to veer away. Eventually, Gibson told him to stand by and gave Henry Maudsley in Z Zebra a go. Maudsley had been picked as one of Gibson's flight leaders. He was hugely experienced, but for whatever reason things hadn't really gone right for a while. His bombing results in the practice were mixed, and he'd come close to disaster, dropping a dummy upkeep at Reculver and trashed his aircraft in the process, meaning that tonight he and his crew were flying an unfamiliar plane, and he was in the doghouse with Gibson. Otherwise it would have been him and not Young who had been acting as Gibson's second-in-command on this leg of the raid. By 0139, neither Shannon nor Maudsley had managed to drop a bomb, despite several attempts by both aircraft, and it wasn't until Shannon's 6th attempt that he finally managed to line up well enough for Len Sumter, his bomb aimer, to push the tit and release his weapon. The bomb ran true and hit pretty damn close to the centre of the dam. For the rest of his life, Dave Shannon reckoned that he saw a breach in the dam caused by their weapon, but if he was right, no one else saw it. Just the explosion, a fountain of water, and then nothing. Maudsley went in again next, but something went horrifically wrong. The bomb was released late. It bounced and hit the parapet, exploding, peppering Z Zebra with fragments. Gibson called the stricken aircraft over the VHF. Z Zebra, are you okay? Henry, are you okay? He heard a faint, I think so, stand by. And then Z Zebra was gone in the darkness. Everyone assumed that it had crashed, but in fact it struggled on and was eventually finished off by ground fire 3 miles short of the Dutch border. There were no survivors. Fearing he now had only one upkeep left and that it would not be enough to breach the Eder Dam, Gibson called at 0142 to Bill Astl's aircraft for support, but Bill and his crew were long since dead. Les Knight in N Nut was the last man up and the only way left to break the dam. He'd done 23 operations with 50 Squadron and he was considered a superb flyer, perhaps the best of the lot. He'd been watching the lines taken by the other pilots and an idea was beginning to form in his head. At 01:47, accompanied by a cacophony of helpful radio chatter over the VHF, he swung AJN down along the same dogleg that Maltby and Shannon had tried, but was immediately unhappy and aborted the approach. Needing a bit of peace, he switched off his VHF as he came in for a second pass, following a line well to the left of the one that the others had gone down. And at 01:52, he and his crew executed a perfect drop and then, and I quote here, had to climb like buggery as the upkeep sped away. It bounced 3 times, hit the wall, sank, and moments later there was a blinding flash which short-circuited the local power station and blew up the dam for good measure. A huge crack appeared in the wall, followed by millions of feet of cubic water which began to pour out of the Eder Sea. The flooding would continue for more than a week. The reserve wave had no designated leader, and they didn't fly in a Vic of 3 in the same way that Gibson's crews had. Instead, they were very much on their own, expected to act independently and go and attack one of the minor dams on Wallace's list from all those many, many months ago when he first written his note. At 01:53, S. Sugar, flown by Burpee, was shot down west of the Rhine, near the German border, witnessed at a distance by Ken Brown and the crew of F. Freddy. Later Luftwaffe reports indicated that a searchlight mounted in a tower on the Gilser-Rieden airfield had shone directly into the cockpit, blinded Burpee and caused the plane to crash. At 02:34, C. Charlie, Bill Otterly's machine, found itself off course and coned by searchlights near the heavily defended town of Ham. The starboard engine was shot away and Otterly had time over the intercom to say, "I'm sorry boys, we've had it," before the aircraft ploughed into the ground and the upkeep exploded. Somehow, against all probability, Fred Tooze, the rear gunner, survived to stagger away, burnt but alive from the wreck. Bill Townsend, Ken Brown and Cyril Anderson were the only 3 pilots left on the outward legs of their journeys. For reasons never really cleared up, Bill Townsend's crew in O Orange was diverted to attack the Eder Dam, one of the minor targets on Wallace's note, whilst Brown and Anderson were ordered against the Sorpe. Brown and his crew took no less than 7 runs at the Sorpe, going so far as to push incendiary flares out of the back of their aircraft to try and check the wind flow, a monumental risk which, had any fighters been anywhere near, would unquestionably have killed them all. On the 8th pass, Stefan Onoka, the bomb aimer, dropped the weapon plumb on the centre of the dam. But 5 Group received the message, Goner 78C. That is, the weapon has been dropped within 7 yards of the dam, dead centre, on target C, to no effect. And they turned for home. Meanwhile, O Orange had managed to find what felt like every flak gun ever manufactured by the Third Reich and endured what Bill Townsend later called a very, very nasty flight. At about 02:45 they suddenly saw a lake below them, but one that was not on any map. It was the floodwaters of the Möhne spilling out across the Ruhr Valley. Eventually they managed to locate the Eder Dam and fired up their rotating gear to get their upkeep going. Immediately the aircraft became almost unflyable as the upkeep was clearly not balanced properly. If you've ever put a weird load into your washing machine and it goes into a spin cycle, it was kind of like that, only with a bomb that weighed 9,250 pounds and was going 500 RPM in the middle of an aircraft. After 3 attempts they dropped the thing, which sank and exploded well short of the dam. They too then turned for home. And it turned out to be the last attack of the night. Cyril Anderson and his crew had become hopelessly lost in the mist, and with darkness fading and the sun beginning to come up, and the rear turret that had become unserviceable, there was really no prospect of finding or damaging the Sorpe, so they turned for home too. The last upkeep may have fallen, but the last crew had not died yet. Tantalisingly close to safety, Dingy Young's aircraft, A. Apple, was hit in the tail by coastal flak and crashed on a sandbar yards short of the water, killing him and his crew instantly. The total cost of this raid on the RAF is sometimes overlooked. 617 Squadron was essentially shattered by it. Of the 19 aircraft that took off with 133 men on board, the raid cost 8 of those aircraft, 53 men dead and 3 missing. It's about 40% of all of the men who'd been briefed back at Scampton just a few hours before. None of the crew who flew with G. George with Gibson that night would survive the war. Indeed, of the 80 men who returned to Scampton, just 48 would make it to VE Day in 1945. Mickey Martin was one of the first attackers to get back to Scampton, closely followed by Dave Maltby and Joe McCarthy, who touched down shortly after 03:25. T. Tommy had had the monkeys knocked out of it on its return leg and touched down, only to discover a 20mm flak shell had gone in one side, smashed up the nav equipment in the Astrodome, and then dropped basically onto the navigator's lap. He hadn't really noticed because so many bits of the aircraft were already falling off, he just assumed it was something else that was native to the plane that had become unattached. Shannon was next back at 0406, Gibson at 0415, Les Knight at 0420, Anderson at 0530, Ken Brown at 0533, followed by Bill Townsend and what was left of O-Orange at 0615. By that point he was one engine down and leaking fluids all over the place, having been shot up on the Dutch coast. As Townsend clambered wearily from his aircraft, a gruff voice demanded to know how it had gone. Knackered beyond caring and comprehension, Townsend simply told the person to wait until the briefing was done and trudged off towards the bus. People, as a rule, didn't usually talk to Arthur Bomber Harris like that, to be honest. Gibson's logbook shows a flight of 6 hours and 44 minutes. As promised, the crews did indeed all get absolutely fucked up once the debriefs were done with, in part elated at a job well done, in part devastated by losing so many men in one trip. Wallace in particular was seen to be in tears when he realised just what his weapon had asked of the crews. In 1972, Bruce Page, an investigative journalist for the Sunday Times, wrote an article saying, "The truth about the Dam's raid is that it was a conjuring trick devoid of military significance." And that, to be honest, was pretty typical of post-war coverage of the raid. Speer said it did nothing, the US Strategic Bombing Survey said it did nothing, the British Bombing Survey said it did nothing, Harris never tried to repeat it. Now all the men that took part are gone. The dams are long since repaired. The war's been over for more than 80 years. The hip young revisionists of the 1970s are mostly dead themselves, and it feels like the right moment to reappraise what happened and ask, was it worth it? And because I am the world's worst edgelord in the history of internet shitposting, I'm going to start with, it depends. On the one hand, the claims being made for the raid at the time were massively overblown. Yes, knocking out the Sorpe and the Möhne would have been a crippling blow for German industry, but it wouldn't have ended the war. And since the upkeep was not capable of taking out the Sorpe, such claims seem a little bit silly. Add to that the very marginal commitment made by Portal, just 19 aircraft, and one can see that no matter what Wallace and Bufton may have said, it just wasn't a potentially war-winning effort. Add to that the limitations of time, the time between greenlighting the attack and the attack itself, meant that there was an awful lot of steps which perhaps could have taken a bit more thought and maybe have a bit more effort put behind them. For example, the bomb site is absolutely brilliant as an idea, but it's improvisation, it's not a proper bomb site. The fact that every single upkeep exploded is nothing short of a miracle in an era when dud bombs were pretty normal, and it does speak to the kind of effort and energy that were put in by Vickers and Avro, and of course by the ground crews themselves. People were completely committed to this attack, and you certainly see that in the crews themselves. You can't question the commitment, you might be able to question the impact, and to look at that we need to think about what the Germans thought. That lying shit Albert Speer, who we will do properly one of these days, had said that he had all of the dams repaired within 18 weeks. Then he gave his usual spiel about how initially he'd been alarmed that it was all terrible, that then he, Albert Speer, had somehow wrestled the situation back and that the stupid Allies had once again failed to defeat him. These interviews always came from his cell in Spandau prison, so clearly the war hadn't gone quite as he'd planned. MI14 reported that the emergency service channels set up by the Luftwaffe and the Gestapo immediately post-raid to coordinate rescue work were shut down within a week, meaning that the immediate crisis had passed quickly. Compared to the Hamburg raid of July 1943, which killed 40,000 people, casualties on the ground were remarkably light. 181 German citizens died immediately below the Möhne Dam, along with 800 female slave labourers who were locked in their barracks and unable to escape the deluge. It's telling that the local police report noted the 1 million Reichsmarks cost of replacing the barracks, not the number of dead prisoners that they'd held. In all, perhaps 1,600 people died as a result of flooding from both dams. That does not mean that the Dam's raid was ineffectual or didn't have any impact on Germany. Far from it. The Möhne attack in particular was devastatingly destructive. A report compiled for Albert Speer showed 100 miles of flooding upriver, with buildings along both banks inundated and the river rendered unnavigable to commercial traffic. Something like 6,000 cattle and 600 pigs and 4,000 hectares of agricultural land were rendered unusable. The critical railway network suffered widespread destruction, with 46 road and railway bridges wiped out, dozens of engines and hundreds of rolling stock swept away. The Herdecke viaduct on the main line between Düsseldorf and Dortmund was destroyed, effectively cutting the Ruhr industrial area from the rest of Germany. Power supplies were disrupted for months, drinking water was contaminated, coking plants were shut down, coal mining stopped, hydrogenation plants making synthetic fuel and rubber were unable to operate. Silt got into drainage and sewer systems, blocking them completely for months afterwards, causing widespread sanitation problems. 12,000 troops were diverted to deal with just the civilian population in the aftermath. Water was, of course, the critical reason for the attacks in the first place. Water for cooling, for drinking, for firefighting and for industry. In the immediate aftermath, supplies for a number of cities close by were seriously disrupted, including Hamm, Hagen, Bochen and Dortmund. Indeed, in an air raid on the 23rd on Dortmund, water for firefighting wasn't available and the city centre burnt out, killing 650 people. But the real challenge for the Reich was what would happen if the dams couldn't be repaired. Short term, there were underground pumps, smaller dams and pipes that could be used to bring water in from elsewhere as a temporary measure. But if the situation persisted and the Reich didn't capture the autumn rains in 1943, then in 1944 there would be a very real crisis. This left them with little choice but to make good the damage at almost any cost, pushing aside any other priority. 756 million Reichsmarks were assigned for the repairs, roughly £7 billion, or about $10 billion today. Speer ordered a total of 50,000 Todt labourers to work on the repairs, with 1,800 on the Möhne Dam alone. Speer's odious underlings, Karl Otto Sauer and Franz Xavier Dorsch, did their best to pull the labour force from across the Reich, including especially France and Italy, but fell well short of this number, as frankly they always did. Speer complained to Hitler and was thus given plenipotentiary powers to recruit labour from the armaments industries and divert them into the construction. Such was the emergency. This was an incredibly short-term decision. Even as all of this was going on, Hitler was attempting to build up resources for Operation Citadel on the Eastern Front, what would become the largest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk. Citadel was designed to buy time for the Reich and space and break the Red Army's counterattacks. For it, prodigious numbers of tanks and artillery and ammunition was required, and yet here was Speer, Minister for Armaments no less, demanding to pull workers out of the armaments industry, something he refused to do at any other point in the war, to get labour to repair the dams. On top of these men, Speer needed labourers used to working with concrete and steel and stone, and who better than the Organisation Todt workers who were working on the Atlantic Wall. He unilaterally recalled 7,000 of them to work on the dams. In April of 1943, workers poured 770,000 cubic metres of concrete into the Atlantic defences. In May, that figure dropped to less than 300,000 cubic metres, and it didn't recover until the first quarter of 1944. Indeed, concrete production, alongside everything else, nosedived from May onwards under Bomber Command's pressure, but we'll come back to that in a tick. All of this meant that when Rommel did take over in December of 1943 and completed a 10-day fact-finding trip to assess the work on the Atlantic Wall, after almost 2 years of effort, he called it a sham, a propagandist's trick. This was, in large part, due to the dam's raid. This gargantuan effort managed to make the Möhne and the Eder dams watertight in about 4 months, which was a hell of an achievement, but they couldn't be refilled until the silted outlets had been cleared and the sides of the dams had been remodelled and massive new defences had been installed. Concrete was injected into all 3 dams to deal with suspected micro-fissures, but at the Eder this went into the drainage system too, meaning that new channels had to be bored, which took months. And on top of this, of course, every dam in Germany suddenly needed torpedo nets, command posts, barracks, flak guns, barrage balloons, searchlights, warning radars, contact mines, hundreds of metres of anti-aircraft nets, smoke discharges and men to crew them all. Something like 300 searchlights and over 1,000 guns were moved out of the cities and deployed to the dams, to sit there uselessly for the rest of the war. Tactically, the raid had shown that low-level flying by the RAF crews was possible, and it was used on a number of raids thereafter, but the real innovation here was the use of VHF and a master bomber to control aircraft during an attack. And this became standard operating procedure for both the RAF and the USAAF for the rest of the war, and proved to be highly effective, if incredibly dangerous for the aircraft in question, which was often then targeted by fighters vectored in from ground control stations who could triangulate where the broadcasts were coming from. All in all, the dams raids were incredibly significant, and it's hard to think of a raid of less than 200 men which had a greater impact until the dropping of the atomic bomb in 1945. For 617 Squadron itself, the losses were, of course, horrific, and horrific for the families that were involved. It was, sadly, a drop in the ocean of death. Their impact, though, was out of all proportion. It's a great shame that so many of the men involved in the raid that night went to their graves believing that they'd not achieved anything, thanks to the revisionists of the 1970s. As you may have spotted in this series, I have consistently offered you the Dams raid whilst also talking to you about the Battle of the Ruhr, and I'm not proposing to stop that now, because the Dams raid was part of a whole, not a standalone operation. The Ruhr was under attack day and night from February to July, and the Dams was just one attack amongst many. The reality is that Harris's grand strategy, his Battle of the Ruhr, came closer to stopping Germany than he knew, and frankly closer than Speer or the USSBS was ever willing to admit. Studies, most notably done by Adam Tooze in his seminal book, The Wages of Destruction, have shown that the impact of the battle on Germany's economy was highly significant. And we noted in episode 1 how iron production dropped by 25%, steel production by 30%, coal production by 40%. Production, which had been growing steadily across the whole of German industry by 5% per month, consistently since 1941, now flatlined until March 1944. Production of all finished goods were impacted by the Dams raid and by the Battle of the Ruhr more generally, because huge stocks of finished and semi-finished goods like crankshafts and tank guns and bearing mounts and so forth were either destroyed in fire or flood. The mere act of applying pressure to Germany in a concerted way also meant that the German economy and the manpower system were stretched to do things which were not in its interests of trying to win the war. And there's probably no finer example of that than talking about flak guns. By the end of the Battle of the Ruhr, something like 250,000 labourers were involved in producing equipment that was solely for anti-aircraft efforts. Flak gun barrel production increased by 30% in the first half of 1943, and over that full year, Germany produced 4,416 88mm, 1,220 105mm, and 282 128mm flak guns. Light flak gun production was scarcely believable, producing over 31,000 20mm guns in that year alone. All of these weapons could have, and perhaps should have, been used on the front line against the Soviets, but weren't. In January of 1943, the Luftwaffe estimated that it was taking 2,805 rounds of heavy flak and 5,354 rounds of light flak per enemy aircraft brought down. A combination of Allied countermeasures, slave labour, rush production, bad training and a degree of panic meant that by December of 1943 that figure was worse. It was actually 4,000 and 6,500 respectively. Ammunition production in these quantities meant that fully 58% of the Luftwaffe's entire budget allocation went to making flak ammo, not planes, in 1943. But it wasn't just about production, it was also about what those flak defences did to society as a whole. There was something like 1,900 flak positions across the Reich, all of which needed crewing. The National Socialists were forced to do what they'd avoided doing up until that point. They had to start calling up women into military service. In 1943, all women between 17 and 55 were made eligible for compulsory military service in one of the branches. The Bund Deutscher Mal, or the BDM, the girls' equivalent of the Hitler Youth, at the end of that year had some 116,000 girls crewing searchlights, barrage balloons and flak guns, all of whom had had to go on a 6-week-long training course. By the end of the war, the equivalent of 30 divisions of uniformed Luftwaffe soldiers were manning anti-aircraft defences. That's about 790,000 troops, and alongside them were some 528,000 women, girls, slaves, workers and Volkssturm Home Guard. The reality is Bomber Command's assault on German industry in 1943 ensured that the Reich's fate was sealed. The Soviets would do the dying, the Americans would provide the industrial muscle, but it was the British that ensured that the Nazis could not regenerate their losses from 1942 in 1943 or 44. They were the stake in the vampire's heart. The tragedy was that if Harris was some kind of Val Helsing, he moved on to bomb Berlin over the summer and didn't remove the head. If he had, perhaps the war really would have ended sooner. There were certainly missed opportunities here. The massive reconstruction that came after the Dams raid could have and perhaps should have been a prime target for further RAF attacks. Workers were operating 24 hours a day, including under floodlights at night, but they were left alone. The lack of water in key cities was not properly considered by RAF planners, and systematic advantage was not taken of the situation. No further raids on German dams were tried with upkeep. Harris saying years after the war, an operation so dangerous that a man had won the VC on it did not bear repeating. We've discussed this before in this series, but Allied post-raid analysis was poor throughout the war. Pictures of buildings with no roofs were considered to be pictures of capacity destroyed, when in fact everything inside, once the tiles and dust was cleared, might be fine. Follow-up and consistent attacks were poor throughout by both the RAF and the USAF, and the Dams Raid and indeed the wider Ruhr campaign were classic cases in point. Harris moved on to attack Berlin too soon. It was a grievous strategic error. The crisis in the Nazi economy that Speer had feared was delayed for another 12 months. Berlin, of course, as we know now, did not burn. The Holocaust went on, the war did not end, and thousands of Harris's crews would go on to die bombing at the extreme end of their range for far less effect than that if they carried on slamming the Ruhr through the summer. It wouldn't be until the oil and transport plans of late 1944 and early 1945 that the Ruhr would once again be the focus of the bombers, and this time true combined bomber offensives between the British and the Americans. But that's a story we will tell another day. And there, I think we will leave things for today. Oh, except we won't, because I haven't mentioned the bloody dog for reasons which I feel is a bit like schoolgirls tittering behind the bike shed at the word Willy. I am apparently, like every other slightly exasperated historian telling the story, required to make some comment on. Gibson named his dog with a racial slur. Why he did this, I neither know nor care. If it's important to you for whatever reason, you go and figure that one out for yourself. I can tell you, if you're interested, that Gibson had a beloved black Labrador, that he took it flying regularly when he was skipper at 106, that he didn't take it on ops, but that he did give it beer. And when it was killed on the morning of the raid, it hurt him deeply in a way that perhaps losing friends did not, because he expected men to die, but not his companion. And I can tell you that he ordered an Urk to make a coffin for the dog, but the NCO refused on the grounds that it was outside his duty to make the dog's coffin for the CO, which probably tells you a lot about the nature of the military body with tens of thousands of conscripted civilians in it, and probably Gibson's relationship with some of them. I can further tell you that Gibson asked Chiefy Powell, the head of the ground crew, to bury the dog at midnight when Gibson expected to be over the dams, and that Powell delegated this task to an airman, which might again say something about the respect which Chiefy Powell was held in by those same men. These are interesting things to reflect on. The dog's name, not so much. Those who are curious should seek out Gibson's book Enemy Coast Ahead and have a read of that and see what he really thought about things. Or come to that, read James Holland's or Max Hastings' books on the subject. They're both great, and actually they're even better when you read them back to back. Or you could try Paul Brickhill's 1952 book, which inspired the film. It's fascinating for hits immediately, and also because so much about the weapon was still classified. Or you could just watch the movie Dambusters. It was made in 1955, and if you're in the UK, it's available unedited on Prime right now for not a lot of money, and it's still compelling viewing. So there you are. The dams, the Ruhr, the dog, and more. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to our continued adventures together in the near future.